Hello, my name is Rebecca D. Winter-Schmidt, and I'm the Associate Program Director at the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. Today's video log introduces a series of webinars which will be conducted throughout 2022 on the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, CR2R for short, and briefly describes what that is. The purpose of the webinar series is to systematically explore the elements of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights as framed in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in order to educate and support investors as they assess and engage with their portfolio companies on their human rights performance. The target audience is active investors such as asset managers, asset owners, pension funds, advisors, and others, and also investors who are involved in the Alliance's Corporate Human Rights Benchmark Engagement, an effort to dialogue with companies who have scored poorly on human rights due diligence related indicators by the benchmark. During the series of 5 webinars, elements of the corporate responsibility to respect will be examined in greater depth. I'll describe those in a second. The corporate responsibility to respect human rights is codified in an international declaration unanimously endorsed in 2011 by the UN Human Rights Council, called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. The guiding principles implement the Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework, reflecting the 3 pillars of the principles. Pillar 1 is the state duty to protect, and it states that states have the duty to protect people from human rights abuses by third parties, including economic actors, through appropriate policies, regulations, and legal means that are at their disposal. Pillar 2, the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, establishes that business enterprises should commit to respecting human rights, act with due diligence to avoid infringing on rights, and should address adverse impacts linked to their activities. The corporate responsibility to respect exists independently of the state duty to protect human rights. In other words, businesses should respect human rights even where governments do not. This second pillar, the corporate responsibility to respect, is the focus of our webinar series. Pillar 3 establishes the right to access remedy. In other words, both states and businesses should work to ensure greater access to effective remedy, judicial and non-judicial, for victims of human rights abuses. So what is CR2R? UN Guiding Principle 15 lays out CR2R, and it establishes that business should have in place policies and processes, including, first, a policy commitment to respect human rights. That'll be the topic of webinar 1. Second, a human rights due diligence process to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their impacts on human rights, including a process for assessing actual and potential human rights impacts, like through a human rights impact assessment, the topic of webinar 2, a process for integrating and acting upon assessment findings and tracking responses to address impacts, topic of webinar 3, as well as a process to communicate findings, the topic of webinar 4. Processes to remediate adverse human rights impacts businesses have caused or to which they contribute is the topic of webinar 5. This diagram here comes from the Investor Alliance's Investor Toolkit on Human Rights, which can be found on our website. What it shows here is that investors should respect human rights at both the institutional level and at the investment level. This diagram focuses to the investment level, and that's what we're going to talk about today. In terms of what asset managers and owners should do during their investment activities, the first thing that's very important is that they communicate their commitment to respect human rights in all their investment activities. Second, they should undertake due diligence on all their investments. For example, by asking portfolio companies whether or not they've committed to respecting human rights, or asking portfolio companies whether or not they've assessed their risks to impact on human rights and whether they manage those risks effectively. Third, investors should use their leverage, either individually or collectively, to engage in responsible investment stewardship, and there's many ways to do so. For example, one can engage with portfolio companies, as in the case of the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark engagement. One can participate in collaborative platforms, such as the Investor Alliance for Human Rights. One can file shareholder resolutions, vote one's proxies, and engage policymakers and standard setters as appropriate. And finally, investors must bear in mind that it may be necessary to responsibly divest when exercising of leverage is no longer possible, or it was never possible, and the investor cannot mitigate negative human rights impacts. The bottom line, this webinar series is meant to help investors effectively engage with their portfolio companies to ensure they implement their corporate responsibility to respect so that investors can meet their own corporate responsibility to respect human rights. Not doing so could result in investors being directly linked to rights abuses through their investment relationships. We look forward to having you participate in this webinar series. Thank you very much.